All right, should we get started? Okay. Hello, everyone. This is an introduction to SIG AWS. I am Justin Santa Barbara. I'm one of the co-chairs of SIG AWS. Nishi is another co-chair. She's not at KubeCon this year or KubeCon EU this year. Chris may or may not show up. She said she had a conflict but would try. So if she makes a dramatic entrance, you'll know why. This is an introduction. I want to do what people want to do. So the way we structured it was sort of around giving a very quick introduction to what a SIG is, very quick introduction to what a SIG is, what SIG AWS does, where the activity is, and then how you can get involved in the SIG. I don't know if that's of interest to people or whether people would rather, are people interested in contributing or are people more interested in questions about AWS? Should I more on the contribution side, more on the question side? Who's more interested in contributions? Put your hand up. Yay, and who's more interested in questions? Put your hand up. You voted twice. Okay. I will go through very quickly the slides then, and we will save, we'll go through, and who's interested in what the SIG has been up to, I should say. Okay. No clear winner there. I'll go through reasonably quickly. Goals, understand the SIG structure, the projects, the subprojects, the plans to evolve into a user group, and how you can get involved in SIG AWS, or actually in general, most of this applies to any SIG, or Kubernetes in general. Kubernetes is a project that grew very rapidly. SIGs are the way that the Kubernetes project decided to sort of break up the organizational structure so that it wouldn't be a handful of people that had to approve everything. SIG AWS is therefore responsible for AWS-specific Kubernetes functionality. There are many other SIGs, so SIG storage does storage, and SIG networking does network. SIG AWS is relatively uniquely a user group. There's a very active community of end users that are using Kubernetes on AWS and having varying experiences and sharing their experiences and talking about it. The primary mechanism for doing that is on Slack. The SIG AWS channel is a bit of a fire hose at this point, but is still a very welcoming place. There are 3 co-chairs, myself, Nishi, and Chris, and we organize bi-weekly meetings. Those happen on Fridays at 9 a.m. Pacific. Please do attend. They're held on Zoom. The time is not great for everyone, but it is not as bad as sometimes. There's a link there to the homepage, which you can go to. Their PDF version should have the links, but otherwise you can just search, and there's a mailing list as well, but honestly most of the activity happens on Slack and in the bi-weekly office hours. SIGs do own subprojects, and so there are a number of subprojects which are under the SIG AWS purview. They are listed here. I am sure you can see them and probably absorb them better than I can read them, but essentially ingress controller, etcd encryption, using IAM for end-user authentication, a bunch of CSI drivers, and then an interesting one which we'll talk a little bit more about a little bit, which is around the extraction of code from the main project. But ELB? What's service ELB? So the load balance, you can create a service of type load balancer, and there's some code which currently lives in the main repo, which will create that. That was sort of done for historical reasons before the Kubernetes project got too big, and so that will end up in this bottom one in the cloud provider extraction. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's a good point. There's another class of code which actually you're right, which SIG AWS does own, which lives in the Kubernetes repo itself. For now. Okay, so in 1.15, there's been some progress, promotion of NLB support, the entry NLB support to beta, some alpha features on these external projects, some beta and some alpha projects on those, and 2 of those new CSI drivers, 2 of those subprojects, 2 of those CSI driver projects are actually new this time. That's a fairly large surface area for any SIG, and so one of the things we're trying to do is be more sort of user-driven and make sure that we're listening to what people are actually using or how people are using Kubernetes on AWS. And so Nishi did send out a survey, and we did receive 31 responses, which is good, but I hope there are more than 31 people in this room, and I hope in future you will all respond so we can have a more representative sample at the next survey. But there's some interesting things. I'm not going to read through all of this, but essentially the AWS Ingress controller has done a bunch of stuff, particularly around E2E, which is super important. The way that all Kubernetes projects maintain quality, or the primary way by which they maintain quality, is to ensure that there are good E2E tests. E2E stands for end-to-end, so it means like actually spinning up, in this case, AWS Ingress ALBs, and actually exercising the code paths and then reporting those test results up into this common grid of results called test grid. And so you can visit test grid and see a wide array of test results. If you're interested more in that, talk to Moonfish. That is his Slack handle, or I don't know if he's here. I don't see him, so, but yes, Moonfish or Nishi. NLB moving to beta, some support for termination of TLS and a bunch of fixes, and some great features coming. And again, Moonfish is the person to talk to about that. The new CSI drivers. CSI is part of this, I guess this gets into the cloud provider extraction idea. CSI is container storage interface. Container, yeah? Thank you. Thanks. And initially, all the volume drivers were in-tree in the Kubernetes repo. That proved to be unmaintainable. And so the CSI project is aiming to create a common interface by which anyone can create a driver so that you can write a driver for EFS or EBS or FSX or NFS or any other file system that you want. And you don't have to go through the whole Kubernetes integration process. You can develop it at your own pace outside of Kubernetes. And so there's some progress in terms of that move from in-tree code to all the drivers being external via the CSI interface is progressing. And part of that progress is to make sure that we have all these drivers in place for the drivers for the file systems that we want. And progress is being made. That is a great area of contribution for anyone that wants to get involved. Even if it's as simple as testing some of these out-of-tree providers, that's very welcome. And if you have a pet CSI target, that's a great place to get involved as well. Okay, let's talk about the big things. So cloud provider extraction. So initially, as we talked about, there was one repo, github.com/Kubernetes/Kubernetes, or sometimes called just shortened to KK. And that all the cloud providers, all the volume drivers, all the networking code, all of that was in-tree. And that basically rapidly exceeded what I call the GitHub envelope. So the GitHub flows and mechanics are wonderful, but sort of start to break down at a certain scale. And the people that were trying to keep up with it simply no longer could keep up with it. And the way that they decided to scale the project was essentially to split that big mono repo into a whole set of smaller repos. So new code, new cloud providers, for example, go into subprojects or separate projects, ideally owned by a SIG. And that's how we have 7 subprojects of our own. And in addition, we wanted to try to take some of that existing code, which of course is still growing, out of the KK, out of that main repo, into subprojects. So that is the CSI drivers, and there's also the actual extraction of the core cloud provider code. So I believe that as of 1.15, the code has made it into the staging area, which is a sort of no man's land from which eventually it will be ejected. It is not clear exactly how it gets removed, but there is someone I'm sure has a plan, and that is we will be at profit. The AWS specific code today ends up in the kube controller manager component, and it will therefore, the new name for it will be the cloud controller manager, or I guess the AWS cloud controller manager. I'm sorry.
This will be just vendored, or there will be like a plugin mechanism so that you will be able to change plugin without, for example, upgrading to Kubernetes?
Yes, it's a great question. So the intention is that there will be no AWS specific code in KK and no GCE specific code, no cloud specific code at all. Instead, that code will, so Kubernetes works with this idea of controllers. So a controller observes the state of, for example, a service object of type load balancer, and will go and create an ELB. Instead of that controller living in kube controller manager, which was built from KK, it will now be in a different repo, presumably cloud provider AWS, maybe, and that will produce a different controller or a binary containing a different set of controllers. It's a little tricky here. The controller that runs in Kube Controller Manager will be switched off. The one that runs in AWS Cloud Controller Manager will be switched on. There will be some sort of leader election to enable a live migration. This is the question mark in step 2. But the sig-cloudprovider is working through all of these issues. And then essentially, you will then be able to, you will choose when running on AWS to install the AWS Cloud Controller Manager. You could install the GCE Cloud Controller Manager. I don't think it would do you any good. And then in theory, you can update the AWS Cloud Controller Manager totally separately. Or if you have a private cloud, you can write your own private cloud controller manager and never share it with anyone else in the world. So you don't need to go through, like, the flip side of all the maintainers having to deal with all this code in KK is that everyone had to push all their code up into this central place. You no longer have to do that. You can maintain your own cloud controller manager. You can fork the AWS Cloud Controller Manager if you want to change the behavior.
How would it get installed?
Sorry, the question that people didn't hear, which is another excellent question, is how will it get installed in Kubernetes? These are the greatest. This is another one of these question marks. There are efforts to figure it out. There's some work going on to figure out that's around add-ons, or is this an add-on? But essentially, creating a package that is more than just the core components. So in 1.0 of Kubernetes, you would install Kube API Server, etcd, Kube Controller Manager, and Kube Scheduler, and that was it. Now, if you look at where we're going to be, you're going to have to install those same 4 components and an AWS Cloud Controller Manager and a CSI driver, probably multiple CSI drivers, probably some CNI drivers for networking as well. And we end up in this world where you have to a release of Kubernetes is much more than just API server, the core components, and includes a set of other pieces that actually vary based on where you're installing. There's an effort called bundles, which is basically like creating a declarative specification of what those look like. Essentially, there will likely be an ongoing piece of tooling. There will be a piece of tooling that will do that for you, whether it's EKS, whether it's COPS, whether it's one you write yourself. But essentially, that will be the role of that piece of tooling. And we have to produce artifacts such that, particularly if you're writing it yourself, which a lot of people still do, that it is possible for you to do that and doesn't become exponentially harder as we take the number of components from 4 to 10. So wary of, I don't know if all right. Okay. This project the CloudProvider extraction project has been going on for multiple years, and it is not done yet, but I do think it is at the end of the beginning in that now the code is in staging. The hope is that now temporarily the cloud provider AWS will vendor that code temporarily, and then we will just stop vendoring and move it all into the other place.
Is that the multi-year project of separating that stuff? Is that something that new contributors might be good for, or is that really going to take a lot of experience in the underlying Kubernetes code to really be effective?
There are mixtures. There are some places where it's intricate, like the leader election stuff is very difficult. There are other places where it's not nearly as bad, and yes, if you are interested in that, I think the right way to go through that is to go to the sig-cloudprovider meetings, which are Wednesdays at around lunchtime sometime, in some time zone. They are sort of driving that effort, and yeah, it's a mixture. But I think we're going to talk a little bit later around how ways to contribute and ways that are not necessarily purely around code, and so, yeah. The other change, along with this, as we move from all these components, from one mega component to a set of components, we have to make sure that all these components sort of behave the same way and aren't entirely different. That your experience on AWS should basically be, as a Kubernetes user, should be pretty comparable to your experience on GCE, which should be pretty comparable to your experience on vSphere or OpenStack or wherever it is. And so that is one of the big purviews of sig-cloudprovider, is to try to establish this sort of common behavior across platforms. And as such, SIG AWS, as owner of code, is going to fold into the sig-cloudprovider SIG. So I don't know if in a year we will have a SIG AWS as a code owner. However, so that group is going to do, common behaviors, lots of testing and documentation stuff, and trying to figure out a lot of these release issues that are indeed challenging. As an end user group, SIG AWS is going to continue to exist, although it may have a different name. I want to call it KUG AWS, and I'm going to keep saying Kubernetes User Group as many times as I can and hope that it sticks. I'm told it's going to be UG AWS, UG AWS, which is disappointing to me personally, but the more important thing is that we continue to have our Slack channel as the means of communication, whether it's UG or KUG. Okay, so I think this is my jotting down of very many ways you can get involved in the project. And you'll see that a lot of them are not at all about code. And the slides are available, but to take, yes. I think one of the sort of the meta points that I would do is, it's not all about code. Even asking questions is super valuable. Trying things out, debugging things, joining the SIG meetings, sharing your experiences as an actual user of Kubernetes on AWS is super important. I talked a little bit in the COPS one earlier about how a lot of the people that joined COPS in the second wave of contributors had a much better understanding of COPS than I did, even though I sort of was one of the people that started that project, because COPS evolved and I had not evolved with it. And they, as new people, were using it in ways that I hadn't anticipated. And that was really good. So you, as newer people that are coming in and seeing this with new minds, are probably more better reflective of where the project is today. And the other meta thing I would say here is the KK repo is a terrible place to start contributing. I would start in the subprojects. So the great thing about all these subprojects is that they all probably are much smaller ponds that are much friendlier and easier, and it's much less likely that your PR will get lost, whereas despite all our best efforts at breaking up KK into a whole bunch of other repos, it is still far too easy for PRs to get lost, and unless sort of people know you, or you know who to poke, or the PR is basically perfect from the start, it's pretty hard to get code merged into there. And there's also a ton of history in there, why things are done the way they are. So I would definitely encourage you to look in the subprojects. So yeah, tactics, make the most of your beginner's mind, recognize that it is valuable, and do scratch your own itch. Think about doing things that matter to you. It's very difficult to come in and say, well, I want to rewrite networking to do this cool thing, even though I'm not personally using networking. I've never used networking. If most people that are successful at contributing in whatever way, whether it's docs or issues, are doing things that matter to them personally. And then docs and questions are just as important as code. We have a lot of coders at this point. There's a pretty big conference. There are plenty of people that can code things. The hard bit is sort of figuring out what to code, or what is broken. But if you do want to code, then start simple. Everyone starts with typos or docs. It's okay. Some people don't like doing typo PRs. I actually don't mind. I think it's an easy all round, a good place to get started and familiar with there's a lot of workflow. When you submit a PR, all these tests fire off, and some of them will fail randomly even on your typo PR, and you'll be like, oh, why did I break something with my typo? And probably it's just a test flake. And so it's a nice way to get going. You can always do it in COPS. You can always, I'm sure some projects are welcoming to it. Some of them are less happy about it, but if you do a bunch of typo fixes in one PR, everyone's going to be pretty happy with that. Again, start in the extremities, the newer repos that are out of tree, and then be willing to have a go. Go is a relatively easy language to pick up. There are a couple of gotchas, but everyone hits them. You also will incorrectly close over a loop variable. I don't know if any Go programmer has not accidentally done that. I do it regularly even now. And then just try, and people will probably help correct your Go code, and you'll learn both Go and the Kubernetes style. And then even if your PR isn't merged, you have achieved something, you have helped. And if you are going to tackle something complicated, which, we're sort of like moving down the tree or the moving up the levels, then do talk about it with people first. Like, talk about it on Slack or in the GitHub issue that you're looking at. And then this is my personal favorite, which is to run multiple PRs in parallel. Like, I always treat my PRs as cattle, not pets. I apologize if that offends anyone, sorry. But it's easy to get personally invested in a PR and then like, why isn't this person reviewing my PR? They hate me. I hate this person. What's going on? But if you have 10 PRs, then it doesn't really matter. You're like, oh, cool, that PR, someone got back to me on that one. So run 10 PRs in parallel and see what flies. And if your typo PR gets ignored in one repo, but happily accepted in another, then that's where you should probably, focus your efforts. I think, I wanted to save a lot of time for questions. I think we've done that. We can also go into more detail about any of the things that we glossed over. But, if we have time, we have time for Q&A, deliberately. Please, here's some things I'd love to hear, like where do you want to get involved? Do you have any immediate questions or feedback from using Kubernetes on AWS? And maybe, are we even missing a whole sub-project? Is there like, we have 7, we have 7, should we have 8? All right, who wants to go first? Sir.
What is the minimum setup that is required to start playing with AWS sub-projects? Is it like one node kubeadm cluster, or how is it? Or is there some support from AWS to give, say, contributors some test resources to do more contributions?
AWS person here?
Yeah, so you could, one of the projects that I'm an authorizer or an approver for is the AWS IAM Authenticator. That, for example, you could install on your Kind cluster or Docker from, well, no, you might be able to do it in Docker for Mac, I don't know. But on like Minikube, any of those kind of things, it's just a webhook from the API server. It just sends a token across and does authorization. You could technically contribute to that from nothing. And then all you have to have is an AWS account and an IAM user added to it.
We're already using AWS IAM Authenticator now.
There you go.
And technically, you can send up PRs without having tested them first, particularly if you write work in progress on them. And they will run a suite of E2E tests on them, which I may or may not have done frequently in the past. So you can do that without any, you can do that. Docs, yeah, Docs better pass. Here we are. Authenticator would love Docs contributions. Is that good? All right. Sure.
This is actually COPS feature question, but it's tightly connected to what you do, right?
Okay.
And I haven't seen this on the roadmap, so I wanted to ask, we have really hard times with security people because they say, oh, listen, there was a hole in Docker and I want to have it tomorrow. And with COPS, it takes up to months to get this done. Is there anything that we could do to try to, I don't know, maybe automate the process and have COPS support every Docker release, just as it's common?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's sort of like we try to draw a distinction between AWS and COPS, but anyway. In the COPS project, we do explicitly list some Docker versions. We could definitely support allow you to put a URL in there maybe, or guess the URL for a Docker version, because I think they follow a pattern. It's not as simple as that. There's also Containerd coming, which I'm a big fan of and will be a little bit more regular, I hope. So, but yes, it is a challenge to install Docker, and yeah, the other place we could put it is we could put it in the COPS has a. Let's talk afterwards. But COPS has a YAML file where we could put it as well, which doesn't require a release. So yeah. Jay.
So my question is about how do you do sort of release coordination between KK and the sort of external plugins repositories, things that are dependent on a particular version in KK or versioning of the upstream AWS APIs, et cetera? So.
It is a great question. Come help us. I think the answer is.
What are your thoughts on this, Justin?
I think the answer is officially to be decided. Technically, I think we're technically leaving that to tools like EKS or COPS or GKE for now. In that SIG release doesn't want to own it as a. I see some dissenting.
So we've sort of done this a little bit with CSI, but it's being done at the docs level. It's not really coordinated at all. Yeah, which goes to exactly what you're saying about SIG release. But in, for example, all 3 CSI drivers, there's a table of what version supports what from the CSI perspective and what Kubernetes version that installs in.
Figuring out, it is a real challenge, and figuring out how we're going to test those things to the same degree that we were testing Kubernetes previously is a great problem. I think it would be nice if we had this bat bundle or YAML file which listed all the things and that we ran the tests based on that. I don't see how we're going to get the test to pass without having that. So that at least gives me some hope, but we might split the tests up instead. It's SIG release today wants to remain, at last I heard, wants to remain focused on the output of KK and does not want to broaden their horizon.
There was talk at one point of SIGs, there was talk at one point about SIGs having multiple roles being added to them that came up in the community call earlier this year. Do you know anything about that?
Multiple roles as in what?
As in like, so there's obviously some SIGs that have like a tech lead for them, like Mike is for sig-cloudprovider, but there was talk that they were trying to add in things like release managers to individual SIGs to kind of offload that.
The last I heard, they were like, there are people that are better at technical things than they are at organizational things, naming no names, and there was talk of having like some distinction, like a tech lead and a chair distinction. I can imagine more of those distinctions would be valuable, but it's not clear to me that a SIG can do.
So if anybody wants to be a release manager for SIG AWS? So if anybody wants to be a release manager for SIG AWS?
Yeah, I mean, or cloud provider, right? But it's difficult for an individual SIG to do that qualification in isolation. Maybe SIG Cloud Provider is sufficiently broad that it could do it, but are we questioned out? Is everyone? Oh.
I'll run around.
Does COPS have a plan to implement the feature of attaching volumes when bringing up nodes? Because you need, for example, in AWS, I'll need EBS volumes attached if I want to, say, run Rook on it or some other software-defined storage.
It's a good question. We don't have that as a feature. I think that in general in the Kubernetes ecosystem, we try not to build something into the tool if we could build it as, say, a daemon set.
Oh.
So like, could this be a daemon set?
Yeah.
And therefore, if it was a daemon set, could it work identically on EKS as it works on COPS, or identically on any tooling that you're using? And was that a question or an answer?
It's an answer.
Oh, cool.
I want to actually, so that is the daemon set that is CSI. So that's what the CSI driver will do for you. It will provision the 3 CSI drivers, the EBS, EFS, and FSX for Lustre, will provision the EBS or the file system. But it's not when the node comes up per se. It's separate through that daemon set.
So I guess that would work if we were running Rook as a daemon set itself, right, or as a workload.
So some process needs to run on each node to call CSI, and what I'm saying that then some process needs to run on each node, which can do a call to CSI to tell that like, I need a 100 GB node or something, EBS.
Yeah, I mean, so to date, volumes have been mounted at the pod level or associated with a pod. And I guess the question is, can we run Rook in a pod so that you can continue to use that, or do we need and use the existing CSI drivers without too much work, or can we?
So how these systems work is that they mount the local disks into something called an OSD to give you the storage pool. So they need the volumes to be mounted at the node level. and not, so what is the entry point to the CSI? Is it PV claim or like, okay. The Rook guys are planning to do something like that. They want to run the hostages on top of PV claims, but still it's a feature request. They're planning to do that. Till that time, I think only having some kind of, but having a daemon set, how do I, we can do something like, we can have a process running as a daemon set and call AWS APIs and attach EBS volumes, but that's a bit ugly and tricky. We have to give some permissions to those daemon sets.
That's true.
I don't know if it's the right approach or not.
I guess let's talk about it afterwards. I think there's like a bunch of approaches, but yeah, the short answer is we're not planning anything on kops. The longer answer is we would love to find something that isn't, if it's something that we don't have to build into kops, or if we can leverage CSI, then that's the way that we try to do things in the community. Like we try to say, like, can we not make it specific to a tool and be applicable everywhere? It might be that we can't do that, and then we have to figure out something better.
Potentially slightly loaded question given the number of projects you already are responsible for. So for reference, I've sort of been semi-involved with SIG Autoscaling for quite a while. We run all of our workloads, apart from control plane, on spot instances. Cluster Autoscaler does not like that. And it's one of those tools where there's a load of there's a load of cloud provider specific code in there. And there's a load of functionality that's, works for Google Cloud Platform, doesn't work for AWS, some of the functionality, and it feels like one of those ones where there's core assumptions in there that stuff that AWS provide as functionality may never mesh in.
Yes. There is an effort, so we can continue to put more and more cloud provider specific stuff into Autoscale, the Autoscaler, Cluster Autoscaler. There's also this other effort called Cluster API. The intent of Cluster API is to produce a Kubernetes API on top of instance management. In theory, we may be able to therefore use spot instances or anything through that approach. And we wouldn't put the Autoscaler would talk to the Kubernetes API, a controller specific to AWS, just like the new AWS Cloud Controller Manager would talk to the AWS APIs. If we expose the relevant functionality in a sufficiently neutral way, because GCE has preemptible instances, which are different, but same idea, and I imagine other providers have it as well. If we can expose those things through the Kubernetes API, we can hopefully, in the same theme, we can, as we talked about with getting it across all the tools, we can have Cluster Autoscaler work across all those cloud providers. Cluster API is ongoing and is not there yet. There is a proposal for an integration between Autoscaler and Cluster API. I don't think it's been merged. I think there are some challenges with races around some edge scenarios. It would be good to do that. My understanding is, at least for the moment, that's where we're sort of putting our efforts, rather than trying to extend the existing per cloud code. An interesting approach is, should we actually have Cluster Autoscaler as a generic project, or should we have AWS Cluster Autoscaler, GCE Cluster Autoscaler, Azure Cluster Autoscaler? Like, is it worth, like, there are differences. Like, I don't know, that's just an idea. I think we have one more. Did you have
merging those groups, does it also mean that the feature sets among different cloud providers will be aligned? Or does it leave, for example, kops as a tool which is like purely made with Amazon? You can do whatever you want. You don't have to wait to get an Azure support, Huawei cloud support, Alibaba cloud support, and so on.
So, I mean, kops does support multiple clouds, and that's sort of separate, I think, to your core question, which is, yes, the goal of sig-cloudprovider is to say, I think one of the things that prompted it was there's this big debate about what happens when you stop an instance on AWS. And it turns out that when you stop an instance on other cloud providers, in Kubernetes land, we do one thing. And when we stop it on AWS, we do something else. We delete the node on AWS, and we don't delete it on other cloud providers. And there was this huge debate about like what the right thing to do is. And one of the goals is to try to tackle those things in the correct forum, because the problem was you had SIG OpenStack saying one thing, and SIG GCE saying another thing, and SIG Azure saying another thing, and SIG AWS saying a fourth thing, and none of us were in the same room. And so this is sort of the value of SIG cloud providers, to say, look, we all should support load balancers. I think everyone supports load balancers. But when we stop a node, this is what we should do. When we stop an instance, this is what we should do on the node level. I don't know if that answers your question, if you have something more specific, but that is very much in the remit, is to say, let's not have slightly different behaviors on the various clouds, but rather when you're using Kubernetes, you should have a relatively consistent experience. You should be able to take your workload that runs on Cloud 1 and run it on Cloud 2.
And etcd manager is part or is connected to the SIG, or is
etcd manager, which will become part of etcd ADM, is part of SIG cluster lifecycle. Lots of SIGs. See, the other reason to fold the SIGs is that we have too many SIGs for people to keep track of. So I can keep track of the 4 or 5 that I am involved in, but there are a lot more than 4 or 5, I'm told. And so that is part of SIG cluster lifecycle, which really deals with management of clusters and how you bring them up, how you update them, how you destroy them, but isn't really as concerned with per cloud abstractions. Well, yeah, but there is an ongoing debate as to where cluster API cloud provider drivers should go. So is that SIG cluster lifecycle, or is that SIG cloud provider, or is that SIG cluster lifecycle? So, dear. TBD, yes, okay. We are at time. I don't know if anyone has any last questions or not, but if you can always come and find me at the end if you do, and thank you so much for attending, and thank you for a wonderful day.